This is what's left of the CBD bag. Shoddy technique and inexperience were its downfalls. Having recently discovered a technique for making sheet material out of plastic bags, I figured now is the time to revisit this project. The goal is still to make a lightweight shoulder bag, specifically for picking up comics on a Wednesday. After some initial concept sketching, I started to zero in on the Warboy design. It's centred around the CBD pouch. A thin pouch with a top zip sized to fit a modern comic book. This will join to a larger body with tension straps below. Finally, 3 removable pouches will be added, which attach with Velcro. I start by drafting a template for the front panel of the CBD pouch and cutting 2 panels from the recycled plastic sheeting. If you're interested in how this material was made, I've covered the process in detail in its own film linked with the iCard. Having chosen the panel I'll use as the outer face, I cut lengths of Velcro and sew these in place. I can then make the zip assembly. To keep things simple, the CBD pouch will be the same depth as the width of the zip. I cut 2 lengths of fabric from some scrap and sew these onto the zip, lining up the raw edges with the edge of the zip, folding it back and top stitching it down. This gives me a nice hidden zip track and some additional fabric for seam allowance. For the rest of the sides, I cut a strip of the plastic sheet the same width as the zip assembly. This is sewn on one end of the zip assembly and folded back and top stitched down. I then walk the tape measure around the edge of the front panel to get the circumference, and the side is cut to that length plus seam allowance. I stitch the open end in place and double check the fit. Once confident it'll fit, I top stitch the other end, pin it in place and jam it through the sewing machine. I add some binding to the edge of the zip assembly before sewing on the back panel. It is important to point out that this is done so that the seam allowance is on the outside of the pouch. This is so that I am able to join the main body to this seam allowance. With the CBD pouch done, I can check that it's fit for purpose and move on to the body. It starts with another zip assembly. This time, it'll be front facing with a big flap to cover the zip track. It's the same process of cutting 2 rectangles of fabric the desired length of the zip opening, and at this point with as much width as possible. One is top stitched so that it is below the zip teeth. The other is folded back to give a flap that covers the entire width of the zip. The excess zip is cut off and 2 squares of plastic are sewn onto the ends. These are folded back and top stitched down. Now the body needs a top. I cut the front panel template down to a size that I like and use it to cut the top panel. This is then sewn to the zip assembly. I pin this to the CBD and walk the tape measure around to find the length of the sides. With this measurement and a width I feel is right, I cut the body's side panel. I'm feeling more confident this time and sew both ends in place. Raw sides together with the zip assembly, then folded back to top stitch them down. At this point, I cut off the excess on the zip assembly. I also cut 2 lengths of webbing for the tension straps at the bottom of the bag. Then, I pin everything together and ram it through the sewing machine. I pop it out to make sure everything went through the machine properly, and it didn't. I quickly unpick the section that got away from me and run it back through the machine. It's now time to work out the strap. I want a quick adjust, like on the acronym 3A1. This was covered in detail in the CBD bag film, but that time I failed miserably, mainly because I used a natural cotton webbing. This time I won't be beaten, and broke the cardinal rule for this channel and bought a bunch of plastic from the haberdashery. For this to work, you need a way to release the tension in the strap adjuster. To do this, I added a D-ring here. After a bit of footering, I ended up with this. The wide cotton webbing will sit on the shoulder. Then there's the quick release buckle I pulled off the CBD bag. From this hangs a loop of the plastic webbing, with the strap adjuster at the other end. The last bit of webbing feeds through this adjuster with a D-ring in the middle and at the loose end. This test seems to be working, so I sew it together with lots of ugly box and bar stitches in contrasting thread to really show just how bad I am at this. I make some covers for where the straps will meet the body of the bag and the other ends of the tension strap, and I can start the last part of the main bag, the back. I take some measurements and have a think. I cut a panel to the size I measured. I've decided to pad and line this part, so I also cut some batting and this lovely yellow polyester, and do a pretty rough job of quilting it all together. I trim the edges and decide to add an internal pocket. Another panel of the plastic cut, I add some binding to the top edge. I then just sew it on. We'll pick that back up in the fault section. I can now join the back to the body. This deserves some explanation as it is a pretty crucial part to get right. You can see that the sides of the body are folded wrong way around the CBD pouch. The back will be sewn onto the body's raw edge with the wrong side facing out. Once the bag's closed up, you're going to have to turn everything out through the zip. So the strap and the tension strap ends have to be in place, pointing into the bag. This sounds pretty straightforward, but it's one of those sewing things that can become a bit of a head fuck if you get tired. But if you understand this principle and how to make a zip assembly, really, there isn't a bag arrangement that's out of reach. Anyway, one last jam through the machine and I can turn it out. I'm happy. Just 2 bar stitches on the tension straps and it's done. And look, the strap works. Ish. Last thing to do is the removable front pouches. Speed round. I make a pattern. It has a back with a flap and a wider front. I cut these out of the plastic. I then cut the flap off the pattern to make a third piece. Then cut 3 lengths of this Black Lodge style cord. Velcro was added to the back and the cord was sandwiched between the flat panels. The plastic was then fused together and this was top stitched to secure it. For the front, I pulled out my box of Animal Death and found this blue chamois leather that matches the webbing beautifully. I cut 3 squares, punched some holes and joined them with a cut to get this. The front could then be folded in and the corners sewn up to create depth. The 2 parts are sewn outside facing, then finally turned out, and this. Not quite. Been using this a little bit. Second time out, I managed to rip the strap off. I'm going to be putting it back together again, making sure that I double stitch this part and also adding the binding tape around the edge just to make the whole thing stronger. I stand by everything I'm about to say, but actually I'm much happier with this bag than it comes across. So this is the finished item. How do I feel about this? Well, let's cover the faults first. There are the usual signs of poor craftsmanship, but I'm okay with that. This is another positive step forward with my craft in the face of the plastic sheeting material, which posed a whole heap of new challenges that I had to figure out on the fly. I probably should have started with something like a tote bag to find my way with the material first. The back panel is a bit of a mess and deserved more consideration so that I didn't end up with these 2 lines down the back. Feel free to let me know what I should have done in the comments. I also should have used binding on this edge. You never know, I might go back and add it later. The zip on the CBD pouch wants to swallow up the fabric, but it's not too much of an issue, but definitely something I will change on future projects. The biggest fail is the closures on the front pouches. They just don't really work. It takes 2 hands to thread the cord when it's empty, and it's entirely infuriating when there's something in it. I also forgot to add these clips when I was putting it on the body sides, which negates the whole modular intention of the mini pouches, as in the end, they don't have any additional attachment spots. The strap is almost excellent. The quick release definitely works, but you need 2 hands to tighten it up, so it's not as fluid an action as I had hoped for, but it brings me great joy every time I use it, so win. I think the thing that I have the most trouble with is the pattern on the plastic. I did okay colour matching all these different parts, but the camel pattern does its job too well and breaks up the shape of the bag. You can't really see the different parts, and overall the form is sort of lost. It's also obviously a low quality material. I kind of thought it would have a similar vibe as those bags made out of truck sidings or sails, but it's not quite there. Maybe it's just amplified by my slapdash technique. Regardless, I'm going to use this bag and see how I feel about it after a couple of weeks. I think I did well with this. My bags are definitely getting better and I will try again. I want to make a weekend getaway bag at some point in the future, using the same materials and applying what I've learned here. Anyway, feel free to soothe my anxieties in the comments, or exacerbate them if you feel the need. Thanks as always if you got this far. Like, comment, subscribe, and if you really like this little sewing channel, share with wild abandon.